Hi everybody, welcome to this video on landslides. So landslides are a geologic hazard that kill hundreds or thousands of people each year worldwide and easily kill 25 to 50 people each year in the United States. And that's not to mention all of the destruction of infrastructure like houses and roads that are destroyed by landslides each year. So in this video we'll learn about landslides, and we'll work through one example of a particularly deadly landslide that happened in 2014 in Washington State in the United States. This was called the Oso landslide, and it happened unexpectedly in the early morning when this hill slope collapsed. This hill slope was made entirely of glacial outwash sediments like sand and gravel, and had been undermined by lateral migration of the river here that had steepened the slope, and then there had been a lot of heavy rains over time, over the weeks and months prior to the landslide. And all those factors combined caused this landslide to occur. This block fell, and the run out of the landslide buried the town of Oso, Washington here, killing 43 people in their homes in this small town of Washington. So in this video we'll try to understand what the factors were that caused this landslide and how future landslides like this might be prevented. So we'll start out with an overview of landslides, then we'll look at how the stress balance controls the likelihood of a landslide occurring, and then we'll look at specific environmental factors that change the stress balance. That could be things like water, vegetation, material properties, or undermining. And then we'll look at a couple quick strategies for landslide prevention and remediation. So there's two basic types of landslides, and they really occur in different materials. A rotational landslide tends to occur in homogeneous materials that don't have pre-existing fractures. Okay? In contrast, a translational landslide tends to occur in bedded or fractured materials that do have pre-existing planar fractures or planar failure surfaces. And the key difference between these two is if the material is homogeneous, the natural physics of slope failure determined that there should be an arc-shaped failure surface, kind of this scoop shape, which as the landslide block slides down it, causes the whole landslide to rotate, and you end up with these back-tilted blocks that have kind of rotated backwards as everything slides. And so that's why we call it a rotational landslide. Now in contrast, if you have pre-existing fractures in your material, the physics don't require this kind of arc-shaped failure, or they don't predict this arc-shaped failure to develop. Instead, the physics are as simple as just sliding this block down the pre-existing plane. So you might change the weight of this block or change something about the underlying surface, and then the block is able to just break away and slide right down that planar surface. So again, those are called rotational versus translational landslides. The rotational occurs in homogeneous materials, and the translational occurs in bedded or fractured materials. So a little bit of vocabulary about rotational landslides. This is what they might look like in the field. This is a pretty classic example. And the things you'll always see associated with these are the slump blocks. So that's the individual blocks that have become separated as the landslide occurred. And then the other big thing you'll usually see is the head scarp. This big landslide scarp is usually arc-shaped, where it cuts across the landscape. And if a landslide is fresh, you'll often see the freshly exposed material showing in that head scarp. And then finally we've got the toe of the landslide. And this is kind of disaggregated, you could say loose material that's kind of been squeezed out the bottom of the landslide, much like maybe toothpaste being squeezed out of a toothpaste tube. So it kind of squeezes and kind of flows out over the landscape. And of course, this is what, in many cases, kills people. For example, this is what buried the town of Oso, Washington, was actually this landslide toe. So those are some of the basic vocabularies of a landslide. And getting back to our OSO example, indeed it was a rotational landslide, and it has a lot of these elements. Here's the head scarp, where you can see those glacial sediments. Here's the back-tilted block. Of course, this is pretty deformed. It's not really a perfect block. And then off to our right, we've got the toe, which buried the town of Oso. All right, so now you're familiar with the basics of landslides. Let's look a little bit about how the stress balance acting on material controls the likelihood of whether a landslide will occur or whether it won't occur. Obviously, not all slopes are going to fail by landsliding. So how do we predict which slopes are at the highest risk of failure? And the risk of landslide failure is determined by what's called the safety factor. And the safety factor we can think of as adding up all the resisting forces and dividing them by the driving forces. So if there's a lot of resisting forces, the safety factor is really high, and it means the slope is not very likely to fail. But if we reduce these resisting forces, okay, then the safety factor drops. Or if we increase the driving forces, the safety factor also drops. And as the safety factor gets lower, we get more and more likely to actually have a landslide failure on a slope. So we can really think of two resisting forces and one driving force. Now, the driving force is always gravity. Gravity is the single driving force. It pulls material downward, and it's responsible for example, the mass of material, right? A landslide block has mass, which is proportional to basically its volume times its density times that gravitational acceleration. So it's always gravity that's pulling things down and promoting landslides. So what's then resisting landslides? Why don't all slopes just fail under the force of gravity, right? Why doesn't everything just collapse being pulled down by gravity? Well, we can think of two resisting forces that prevent the collapse of materials. One is cohesive strength, and we'll look at that in a second. So materials have intrinsic strength. They don't just collapse. And then the other is, in cohesive strength is especially important in homogeneous materials that don't have pre-existing fractures. Because in order to break and have a landslide in a homogeneous material, you need to actually break it and actually overcome that cohesive strength. Now, if you do have pre-existing failure planes, like an embedded material or a fractured material, then friction becomes the most important resisting force. And that is frictional resistance holding two blocks together and preventing them from sliding. So let's look at these more closely. Here's driving force of gravity. And the basic idea I want you to get here is that gravity always pulls down vertically. We know that. So gravity is always vertical. What changes is the steepness of a potential failure slope. So in very steep slopes, some block of a given mass, say 10 kilograms, feels the effect of gravity pulling it down a lot more intensely. And we can think of that, we can quantify that by saying the proportion of the gravitational stress that is parallel to the surface is bigger if this slope is steeper, right? So for a steep slope, the proportion of gravity parallel to that slope is big. For a shallow slope, the proportion of gravity parallel to the slope is really small, okay? So obviously in the steeper slope, more of gravity is working parallel, and it's going to make things more likely to fail. And we quantify that proportion of gravitational stress that's perpendicular to the slope. That's actually called the shear stress. There's actually a name for that, and it's called the shear stress. That's the proportion of the gravitational stress that's parallel to the slope. And the take-home message here is that as slopes get steeper, shear stress gets bigger, and the driving forces become more intense. So let's look at the resisting forces now. One of the most important is cohesive strength. again, this is important in materials that are not pre-fractured. So just a couple examples. What does that mean? Sand is something that has a low cohesive strength, right? It's not stuck together. It will break immediately with the slightest bit of stress, okay? It basically has no internal strength. It just collapses into a pile immediately. Granite is an example of something with a high cohesive strength. This block has a lot of internal strength. In order to break it, you'd have to hit it super hard with a hammer. And so this would be something that would be really strong. And that's why we often see, granites making up steep cliffs, for example, where that cohesive strength is able to allow a steep cliff to survive without breaking. So just bringing us back to that Oso example quickly, you can see that the Oso landslide happened in these glacial sands and gravels. Obviously, this is not granite, that's for sure. This is unconsolidated sand and gravel, had very low cohesive strength. So as the stress is built up in this hill slope, it didn't take a lot of stress to cause the landslide failure because the cohesive strength was so low. And of course, this is an example where you probably didn't have pre-existing fractures in the material. So it probably was really the cohesive strength that governed the failure of this landslide. All right, so now let's look at that last resisting force. That's the resisting force of friction. And this is most important in situations where we have pre-existing fracture planes. And it really depends on three different factors. One is the length of the potential slip plane. If the slip surface is longer, then we have more area along which friction can act, and that's going to have a net of more resisting force. Likewise, the roughness of the surface. If the interface between the block and the surface is rough, that's going to have a higher coefficient of friction and is going to be a higher resisting force. And then finally, normal stress. So normal stress is the proportion of gravity that acts perpendicular to the surface, okay? As shown by this blue arrow here. And so normal stress actually acts to hold the block in place. It acts to pull it downward and push the block against the sliding surface. Whereas shear stress, of course, was acting to accelerate that block along the surface. So let's look more closely at this idea of shear stress and normal stress. Just to recap, shear stress is the stress that the proportion of gravity that acts parallel to the failure surface. We're going to denote that as sigma t. And normal stress is the proportion of stress that acts perpendicular to the surface. We're going to denote that as sigma n. So both of these arise from gravity or from the weight of the material. And the key point is that as we change the slope of this surface, the relative magnitudes of shear stress or normal stress actually get bigger or smaller. So if we were to make this slope 60 degrees instead of 30 degrees, the size of the shear stress vector would get bigger, and the size of the normal stress vector would get smaller, and we would be more likely to have a landslide because shear stress was so much bigger than normal stress. So we can summarize the competing effects of shear stress and normal stress with this equation and this plot. And this equation is called the Coulomb failure equation. And what it does is it relates normal stress on the x-axis to shear stress on the y-axis. And it predicts a line at which failure will occur. So this is the equation of a line where we've got shear stress is on the y, the intercept is cohesive strength, the slope of the line is the coefficient of friction, and then the x value is the normal stress. So that equation predicts this line here, and this line is experimentally determined for different materials, which is why we show this plot as a bunch of different experimental data points. And each of these data points represents a combination of shear stress and normal stress at which a material failed. And if we fit a best fit line through that, we're left with the best fit Coulomb failure line here. So what does this mean? It means that if you're at some state of stress over here, so a given normal stress, roughly 200 megapascals, and some other shear stress, roughly 100, this is the state of stress acting on a given material at a given time. And as long as you're below the Coulomb failure line, then the material is not going to break or slide, okay? But if you increase shear stress relative to normal stress, then the material is going to break or slide. And so again, this is just showing you that we know normal stress acts to magnify friction and prevent failure. So if you have high normal stress, you're off in this area and you're not in danger of failure. But if you have really low normal stress, then you are in danger of failure. Likewise, if your slope gets steeper and you increase your shear stress, you move up this way into a high shear stress area and you are in danger of failure. So in summary, this Coulomb relationship predicts a line which we'll call the failure line. If you're above the line, your slope is going to fail or your material is going to break. If you're below the line, your material is going to be intact. Okay, so that's how stress balance controls the likelihood of a landslide. Now what we want to do is we want to look at some of the environmental factors that can actually change the stress balance, right? How can we move around in that normal stress versus shear stress space? And we'll look at 5 things. We'll look at the effect of water, the effect of vegetation, material properties, and undermining. So let's start with water. If we start to saturate our material with water, one of the main things that happens is it fills up the pore space in the rock. And as that pore space gets full, it actually adds weight to the rock. Literally the density increases and the material weighs more, whether it's rock or sand, okay? So we're adding weight. Now, the effect of adding weight, of course, that makes gravity more intense and it actually increases both shear stress and normal stress. So if our state of stress was here originally in the blue dot, adding water and thus adding weight is going to actually cause both the normal stress and the shear stress to increase. And if they increase along a trajectory that actually crosses the failure line, then you may end up with a landslide occurring. Of course, in some cases, if your slope is really shallow, they may increase along a different trajectory where normal stress may increase more than shear stress, and in that case your slope would actually become less likely to fail, potentially. So water, the first effect of water is that it adds weight, which adds both shear stress and normal stress, which in some cases can lead to failure. The second effect of water is that the pore pressure goes up, and it reduces the effective normal stress. So what do I mean by this? If you think of a granular material like a sandstone, we have all this pore space, and as that fills up with water, there's actually a hydrostatic pressure. The weight of the water column causes pressure to be exerted outward in all directions from these pores. It's the equivalent of like a hydraulic jack, basically. The column of overlying water causes pressure, and that pressure pushes outwards against the individual grains of sand. And so what is the effect of that? That's called a pore pressure, and it basically pushes back against the normal stress. You can imagine that this sand is feeling the weight of the overlying rock as a normal stress, and that's part of what's holding it in place. But then when we introduce this pore pressure, it pushes back, it reduces the effective normal stress, and actually can move us closer to failure. So in this case, if we start out some combination of normal stress and shear stress. If we add in pore pressure, it's going to reduce our effective normal stress and actually shift us over to the left here, and in which case we may cross the failure line just by having added this pore pressure that reduced the effective normal stress. So getting back to our Oso landslide, water loading was clearly an important part of what happened at Oso. There had been heavy rains for the weeks and months before, which had presumably added a lot of mass into the head wall of this landslide scarp, and that extra mass may have, and pore pressure for that matter, may have triggered the stress state to go into a failure mode. So let's look now at vegetation. The effect of vegetation can go in either direction. It can either increase or decrease slope stability. On the one hand, vegetation tends to promote water infiltration. So if you have a vegetated slope, you tend to end up with more water going into your material, which then can increase the shear stress, as opposed to that water just running off. So in that case, vegetation may promote loading. Of course, vegetation itself also has mass. If we look at this slope that failed at Oso, these trees actually weigh something, so they can actually add to the mass and the shear stress. But then on the other hand, root structures actually add cohesive strength. So in many cases, roots can actually act to hold together a bank. They can add extra cohesive strength, which might actually prevent landslide failure. So another effect is the effect of material properties, right? And this is really important. Different materials have different properties that affects their likelihood of failure. So in particular, unconsolidated material has a low cohesive strength. So imagine a really old weathered soil. This has no cohesive strength relative to bedrock. And so what happens if we lower cohesive strength? Well, back to our Coulomb equation here, we actually end up, if we drop the cohesive strength, or C, which is the intercept of this line, we actually drop down the whole line. We shift it downwards, offset from the other line, which of course for a given state of stress would make you more likely to fail if your whole failure line actually shifts downward. Now another material property, of course, is fracturing and bedding. If we have a lot of planes of weakness in our material, like we're showing here in this bedded sedimentary rocks, where these sedimentary beds can act as planes of weakness, these different planes may have different coefficients of friction between them. It may be that some of these beds are quite smooth and slippery. And so if we reduce the coefficient of friction along some of these beds, that's going to, sure enough, lower the slope of the failure line. It's going to bring us from a steeply sloping failure line down to a shallowly dipping failure line. And that's because we're reducing the coefficient of friction, mu, which of course defines the slope of that line. And so for a given state of stress here, shown in blue, it might be that just by reducing that coefficient of friction, you move the failure line, which would actually cause a given state of stress then to cause failure. And by that I mean cause slip along these surfaces. So just a couple examples of what I mean by pre-existing fractures that could have low coefficients of friction. Here's an example of some sandstone beds in Santa Barbara along the coast. These are steeply dipping sandstone beds, and you can see we've had a little translational landslide come down off these sandstone beds here. Likewise, here's a bunch of fractured granite in Yosemite, where we've got a lot of these pre-existing fractures that could act as slip planes. So depending on the coefficient of friction along these potential slip planes, we may or may not get translational landslides. So the final effect I want to talk about is the effect of undermining, okay? And what I mean by undermining is basically erosion of the base of the slope. So if this is a material, in this case rock, and this is an incipient fracture plane where we might get some sliding, what happens as we undermine this slope? Okay, well, two things happen. One thing is that, of course, we locally increase the slope here, right? So if we remove this material, for example, by bulldozing a cut for a road or a cut for a house, we're going to increase the slope locally here, which may make it more likely to fail. Also, we will have reduced the length of the slip surface, okay? And so recall that the total frictional resisting force is proportional to the length of this surface. So if we undermine it and we reduce the length, we're reducing the frictional resisting force, which may make it more likely to then fail. So that's pretty classic, that undermining is really an important precondition to failure in many different environments. So one example is here, where the Sangpo River has cut down at the base of these hill slopes. And of course, it's created locally steeper hill slopes, which has increased the importance of shear stress and caused a lot of these landslides to actually trigger and occur into the Sangpo River. So in this case, it's actually river erosion that's actually driving the undermining. And that was likely a factor at Oso as well. This is an aerial view of the topography at Oso. Here's the river coming down, and this, of course, is prior to the landslide itself. But the river had obviously been migrating back and forth within this valley, and it in particular had created a bunch of kind of meander scars or cut banks out here, where it had obviously steepened the slope out against this side of the valley, and eventually these oversteepened slopes have failed by landslides in the past. Unfortunately, one of those landslides was large enough and had the correct trajectory to actually bury the town of Oso here. But the key point is that the river migrating back and forth had undermined the slopes and set the stage for landslide failure at Oso. So we'll wrap up here with a little bit about landslide prevention and remediation. So we know that water can be a really important driving factor. It adds mass and it reduces pore pressure. So a lot of landslide prevention strategies are focused on getting water or preventing water from going into the rock or material. And common ways to do that are to install drainage ditches, like we see here, trying to make sure that water runs off the slope quickly and doesn't penetrate into the material. Another way to do this is to actually put impermeable covers. Sometimes we'll see soil cement or concrete actually being applied, which can also prevent water from penetrating in, and it can also add strength to the material. But of course, you've got to leave drainage holes coming out of your cement so that any water that does get in can get out. And then a second strategy is a retaining wall. So obviously, these are particularly effective at adding support after a slope has been undermined, okay? So in this case, a road cut has been blasted to make a new road. We've undermined the slope here, and so we've made the slope more likely to fail, and to try to buttress that, we've built a retaining wall that's going to basically act as an extra resisting force to prevent this whole material from sliding. So retaining walls don't really address the underlying instabilities, but they do provide that extra strength to keep the slope intact. And here's an example of a retaining wall along Highway 2 in Southern California. So in summary, we've given you an overview of landslides. We've talked about how the stress balance in a material controls whether it will fail or not. And then we've looked at some environmental factors that change the stress conditions and might promote or detract from the likelihood of failure. And then we finished with a couple examples of prevention and remediation. So thanks for listening to this long video. I apologize, I'm sick and tired. But we're almost there, so stay strong, everybody. Here's a couple concept questions, and we'll see you on Monday.